Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced. The best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. What does your team and organizational culture have to do with the Galapagos Islands? Keep listening. Remember, culture is dynamic, which means it's changing all the time, ever-changing, ever-evolving, growing and or deteriorating, but hopefully always strengthening. And as we've spoken on in a previous podcast, I've shared with you that culture is your competitive advantage. In a world of so many choices, culture is your competitive advantage. Those leaders, teams, and organizations who proactively and intentionally shape the culture of how they do what they do are the ones that expand and thrive. Authentic and unique culture to you. What is the authentic and unique culture for you, not someone else? That's your competitive advantage, is to find, to seek, to explore, and to create the culture that is authentic and unique for your team, for your organization, not just duplicating what someone else does. It's about your culture. And every culture, whether new or old, has its own cultural ecosystem. If your culture is just starting out, if your team is just starting out, if your company is just starting out, if your culture is in the beginning stages, then it's easier to identify the species that occupy your ecosystem because many of them have all been there from the beginning. But still, it's critical as you shape in those beginning stages of your team and your organization, your culture, of what it is that you want it to become. But it's a little easier to identify the species that are involved because they've all been there from the beginning. But for those cultures that have been around for years, decades, teams and organizations that have companies that have been around for years and decades, these cultures are changing and in many cases need to change, and are because change in cultures are dynamic means they're always changing. But it's also helpful to realize that there are often different species that play a role in your cultural ecosystem. Let me explain. And I'll start with the term ecosystem because you may not have that definition right in front of you. But the term ecosystem, the definition is it's a biological community of a complex and interconnected system. An ecosystem is a biological community of a complex and interconnected system. A few years ago, my extended family took a once-in-a-lifetime trip to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands, which sit 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, a collection of volcanic islands that sit on either side of the equator in the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the most treasured parts of the world and one of the most treasured ecosystems, interconnected systems of species that are living and working together. On this unbelievable once-in-a-lifetime trip, there were naturalists who were guides on different parts of our trip. And I remember one of the naturalists in particular that talked about the 3 types of species in the Galapagos Islands. He talked about that the first type are native species. Native species. These are the plants and the wildlife that are native to the area, meaning that they've been there from the very beginning of when these islands were formed. These are things like mangrove trees that are native to there They've been growing since the beginning of these volcanic islands existed, and so these mangrove trees grew, and they're native to there. They're from there, but you can also find mangrove trees in other places around the world. But they're native species in the sense that they've been there from the beginning. The second type of species on the Galapagos are what they call endemic species. Endemic species are species that are unique to only this spot in the world. These are things like marine iguanas, blue-footed boobies, these little Galapagos penguins, these unique species that you can only find in the Galapagos Islands. These are endemic species that are only found in the Galapagos. And the third type of species that you find in the Galapagos are what they refer to as introduced species. Introduced species. These are species that are not native to the area and really are only there, only on the islands, because they've been introduced and come to the islands via travelers. So these are species like ants, rats, goats. These kind of species were not native to the area, and their only way, and they're certainly not endemic, they're not unique only to that area, but they have been introduced to the ecosystem. They've been brought in from other places and now are a part of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is now reacting and responding to their addition. Well, your team and organization, if you've already gone there in your head, it has its own ecosystem. Every team and organization on the planet, every company, every sports team, every organization has its own ecosystem. Every family has its own ecosystem. And again, as I've talked about, culture is dynamic, so it's always changing, but it's important for us to know what are the types of species that are a part of your cultural ecosystem. It's important for us to step back and assess your species, and also intentionality around how these species cohabitate and work to grow and develop your cultural ecosystem. Because all of the different species are at play, are adjusting and adapting to one another. But the question is, if we're going to cohabitate, how do we work together to grow and develop the cultural ecosystem that we want with the species that happen to be in our cultural ecosystem? So I have no doubts that as you step back and you think about your team, your family even, your extended family, your company, your team at work, whatever that is that comes to your mind, I'm sure that you think about the different species that are involved with your culture. And I'm guessing that there are those native species on your team or in your organization, those native species that have been there from the beginning. They are the ones that have been there from the very beginning. They are familiar with your way of life in your company or on your team. And even though these are the types of team members and role players that you can find in other companies, examples of them in other companies, they are native in the sense that they've been with your team or from your organization from the very beginning. Then I'm guessing if you look across your company or your organization, you can identify those that represent the endemic species. These are the unique players, the unique to only your team and your company. And in fact, they've learned how to adapt, grow, and thrive on your island, but might not be necessarily successful elsewhere. They are unique to you. That you can't find them. You can't find these people or these roles even in particular, or these, the types of things that they do and are a part of your company organization might not be successful on another island. They are endemic. They are unique to you. And lastly, there are introduced species. And if every team and organization that might come to your mind, there are always, each new year, there are new players that are recruited. There are new players that join your ecosystem, new players that join your team, join your family, join your organization or your company, and they bring their own new normals. They bring their own norms to your culture, to your ecosystem. And now these introduced species are now having to learn how to work within your system, but then also all three, the native, the endemic, and the introduced, are challenged to be able to cohabitate and think about how do we want to grow and develop our cultural ecosystem so that it becomes the ecosystem that we want, the culture that's unique to our islands, and the culture that we want people to experience anytime that they work with or are part of our team, our organization, our company, our family, our unique cultural ecosystem. Each species impacts the others, and all play a role in what the cultural ecosystem becomes. Either it's going to be intentional or it's going to be scattered and inconsistent. And so, like always on this podcast, if now your mind is racing and thinking about the kind of cultural ecosystem you have in your team and organization, I want to provide you with an opportunity to have some questions to ponder, some reflections for this week or for this idea to carry with you beyond this podcast. And so here's some questions to ponder. I hope you'll step back to assess your ecosystem. Step back to think about your team, your family, your company or organization. Think about that ecosystem. Who are the native species? The ones that have been there from the beginning. Who are the endemic species? Those unique players and people that are unique to your team, your organization, your island, that might not be successful elsewhere, but are unique to you. And who are those introduced species? Those species who have now come into the team, into the organization, into the company, into your ecosystem, and now are needing to adapt and or are needing to be included and work together, all of the species, to grow that culture you want. What intentional steps are being done to help all of these species cohabitate? Is it intentional or scattered? And remember, most ecosystems have different species, but the best intentionally help them grow and develop together. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to your organization, or you have a question or comment about this podcast, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.